Um, the goal of this webinar really is to provide managers and management with an overview of the ISO 14000-2015 requirements and the new founded requirements for management to demonstrate leadership, commitment, and accountability. I think all those issues had always been there, but now your external auditors have actual words and ways that they can expect you to demonstrate that leadership, commitment, and accountability. And without a clear understanding of the ISO 14000 process and your own environmental system, it's going to be a challenge to do that. So again, the goal here really is to get you accustomed to the standard, the requirements, and then provide you explanation of some of these new terms. What are risk and opportunities? What's a life cycle perspective? What are the intended outcomes of your environmental management system? And oftentimes with your external auditor, when they ask a question and you can clearly answer the question using these words, it conveys to them clear competency on your part to show that leadership, commitment, and accountability. So that's my goal, is to make this process much simpler for everybody. ISO 14000 was first passed or issued in '96. It went through a fairly minor revision in 2004, and then the last revision was September 2015. And this revision has been significantly different and bigger than the last one. And really what the ISO 14000 standard does is it sets a framework for the management of your operations to minimize your impact on the environment and your consumption and use of natural resources. And I say that because the standard tells you guys what to do, and somebody within your organization has decided how to do it. So just because you read it in a procedure, that's somebody's best idea to meet the requirements. It's not part of the standard. So a lot of times people will say, well, our procedure says this, so it is what it is. Well, no, our procedures and the way that we meet the requirements of the standard are all based on the organization's interpretation. And as a manager, you can suggest changes. This is not clear. I don't understand this. It won't go against the standard, and it'll just be some feedback as far as your overall environmental program. The focus of the changes to the standard, one of the big changes is it's expanded the scope of your environmental program beyond your individual fence line. The standard now asks us to consider what are activities that we can control or influence, and specifically the activities of our suppliers and outsourced services. There's a definite focus on management, not a management rep, not the site leader, but of the entire management team to understand the environmental program and to be able to demonstrate leadership, commitment, and accountability. And there's no way to do that without an understanding of the process. And as an auditor, we get to many sites, and we talk to the shipping manager, logistics manager, the engineering manager, the purchasing manager, the quality manager, and they don't have a clue of a lot of the environmental processes. And that, we're hoping that ends. And this is one of the focuses of this webinar. There's a big push to understand and monitor environmental performance. And we got a kind of a big section on the back end of this webinar about some of the concepts of trying to measure environmental performance. A lot bigger expectation to see the environmental program integrated into your business. So instead of having separate procedures, separate meetings, separate processes for the environmental program, we need to see how these are now integrated into your business. And over the years, many organizations have gotten better at that, but there still are a number of even larger organizations that have pretty distinct silos. And we'll now try to break down those silos between production and quality, environmental and safety. Hopefully that'll occur. There's an enhanced requirement to identify risk and opportunities and aspects now from a life cycle perspective. And we'll talk a lot about what that means, because that's kind of a big deal. And then lastly, we're expecting to see environmental communications to be much more proactive than reactive. So as part of our normal communications process, we need to be discussing issues and topics related to the environmental program. And again, I'll say it one more time, if you have questions, chat them in. And at the end, because this is a smaller group, we may be able to open it up for some online discussions, but I've had limited success with that process. So again, as we go through this, please chat in with questions. It'll make it much more interesting. Alan's already emailed me a question. How do you apply these things to a lower risk site, someone that's got very limited impacts? And as we go through this, we'll talk a little bit about how to apply those things. One of the new things is this term intended outcomes of your environmental system. And it's the same with the ISO 9001 ATF process. What are the intended outcomes? Now, the goal of your environmental system is to achieve your intended outcomes. And the minimum intended outcomes of your program are to enhance environmental performance. So as a manager, you need to understand your environmental performance. To meet compliance obligations of interested parties. Again, as a manager, you'll need to understand, in my department, what are the compliance obligations? Now, those are primarily going to be legal requirements, customer requirements, but again, have some awareness of how they apply to you. Achieve your environmental objectives, and to potentially support your corporate sustainability program or corporate level procedures. So these would be considered minimum intended outcomes of your environmental program. So when your external auditor says, well, can you tell me about the intended outcomes of your program? Chime in, enhance performance, meet our compliance obligations, and achieve our objectives. Again, we're not going to cover each element of the standard in specific detail in this webinar. Just wanted to kind of show you how it's laid out. Again, it's based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act process as it was before. Under the planning element, it talks about the context of the organization. There's a whole section here on leadership. That's management. That's why we're here. The planning process, we'll talk about identification of risk and opportunities. Very similar process to significant aspects from a life cycle perspective, setting objectives. The support processes, we won't talk a lot about those. Under doing, again, how do we do our activities to control our impacts? Checking, how do we monitor and measure our performance? How do we report that performance to management? How do we audit our system, and how do we evaluate compliance? And then under action, what are our processes for continual improvement and corrective action for nonconformities? So the first section under 4.0, context of the organization and scope, deals with the context of your organization, interested parties, and scope. And this whole section is designed to um, basically expands your scope past your fence line. If you look at the previous version, 4.1 general requirements was 3 sentences. You shall have an environmental system, you shall define your scope, and you shall continually improve. The new standard has 4 elements. So the words have expanded, but really the meaning of, you need to take a consideration of your context, who you are, the interested parties in your environmental system, and understand things that you can control or influence, and define your scope. And this word context to the organization, this is one of the new words. What is our context? And it's essentially any internal or external issue that can impact your environmental system and your ability to meet your intended outcomes. Doesn't require these to be documented, but we must demonstrate that we've considered them. Interested parties, legislation, regulations, customers, our suppliers, our employees, our owners, our management. These are all people that are interested in our environmental program. And then the scope, which again now extends to activities and impacts beyond our fence line. So go ahead and here's some examples of things that could be related to your context. We have high employee turnover. Well, what's the issue? It creates a lack of engagement with the environmental processes and awareness. We should see this acknowledged by management and management review, and also in the employee retention process. Potentially, we could have an active rail line that runs adjacent to our property. What's the issue? The potential is for a derailed chemical tanker to derail right adjacent to our property. Again, in our environmental response process, we should address what do we do in the likelihood of that occurring. Before, that would have been out of scope. We don't control it. It's not our deal. But now that it's part of our context, we can't simply ignore it. So, and again, you wouldn't have to add a lot to your environmental or emergency response process. Just a small section, train derailment, XYZ's employees would evacuate building to the front point, and this is how we would respond. Went to another site that they had a propane storage tank next door, a propane storage facility. And so there's potential for there to be a release of propane or an explosion. Again, because of the context of the site, we can't ignore that anymore. Because of our company, potentially we could have a restriction on capital or a very short payback criteria. Well, this is going to impact our ability to implement continuous improvement projects. So we should see some discussion of that during the management review process. Another example is your site's located in a ozone non-attainment area. This would impact your air permitting and regulatory requirements, and you'd see an indication of that in your compliance process. You may have a corporate sustainability program. It requires you to do certain reporting, and we should see that as part of your monitoring and measurement process. So these are just some examples of things that could be part of your context, the issue that it could affect, and where you might see the evidence of that in your EMS program. Now, this particular element doesn't require specific documentation of your context, but it requires you as a manager to be able to answer the question. What are issues that you've identified relative to your context, and how have you considered those in your environmental management program? And that's a very likely question you will receive during your registration audit, and being able to articulate that across the management team is going to be important. Interested parties, again, I like the visual because it's a pretty picture, but just some examples of who are parties that are interested in our environmental program. And we need to be able to, again, articulate who we've identified as interested parties. Obviously, you know, the government regulators, the EPA, the state regulators, they've always been interested. You know, our employees, again, they are interested in clean air quality, working for a company they feel is environmentally responsible. Our customers are interested. They want us to be certified. Our stakeholders and shareholders want us to be have a brand that they can be proud of. They don't want to hear about regulatory fines that could impact the shareholder value, and they don't want to be in the front page news. So the requirement is that we understand who these interested parties are, what it is that they expect from us, and then do these expectations turn into compliance obligations? And once we identify these as a compliance obligation, we will manage these as part of our compliance process. So in 4.2, we're just going to understand who they are and what they expect from us. And does this affect our scope? And again, here's some examples of interested parties. You know, our owners and stockholders are interested. They want us to have a brand and maximize value. They might expect us to have a certified system. Our labor union, they want employees to be safe, indoor air quality, indoor noise, and that those can be reflected in a union contract. One that you might have not identified before is your registration company. They are an interested party to your environmental system, and the compliance requirement is your contract with them. You must comply with the registration contract. So that's the freebie. When you go back to your compliance process, identify the registration company and their contract as a compliance obligation, and that will clearly show how you've updated that process and included a newly identified interested party. And I'm not trying to test your eye skills here. This is not an eye test, but you should be able to read this much more clearly on the handout that I did email to you. So the concept here is we're just going to acknowledge who these interested parties are, understand what they expect from us, and then which of these turn into compliance obligations. And last but not least, we have to define our scope. We have to have a description of our scope and describe who we are, what we do, what activities and processes are covered, and just describe our program. Now, this particular template is one that we've used at a number of sites and has been audited and approved, but it's not a requirement. You just have to look at the requirement of 4.3 and define your scope. The big deal here is looking at the impacts of our services that we might outsource and our supply chain. That's a big deal. That's all covered under the life cycle perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So at this point, we've understood our context. We've identified our interested parties. We've defined our scope. Now under 5.0 leadership, there's a specific element on management leadership, which says top management must demonstrate leadership commitment and accountability for the effectiveness of the EMS. Now, There's no way to demonstrate that without an understanding of your EMS. And yes, we have gone to many, many sites where management level people don't understand their EMS. They don't understand what an environmental aspect is. They don't know what their significant aspects are. They don't know their performance criteria. They don't know their objectives. That will no longer be allowed. So again, to demonstrate the leadership commitment, accountability, you need to know how your department impacts the environment. What are the significant impacts of either your organization or at least of your department? What are the environmental measurables, and how does your department impact the measurables? And what are the current environmental objectives, and how do you impact those? We also need to see evidence that the EMS is aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. That's pretty easy to do. Our environmental program keeps us in compliance, protects our company's reputation, and helps maintain cost controls in key areas of waste and utilities and those types of things. So it's easy to show the alignment, but you need to understand the alignment when you're being audited. We need to integrate the environmental requirements into your regular business processes. So if you have a management review meeting for quality every month, it's going to be hard to justify not at least touching on your environmental measurables during some of those meetings. If you have an annual strategic planning meeting where you discuss budgeting and forecasting, you should be able to show some evidence that your environmental program was discussed during that meeting. It doesn't require us to have everything integrated everywhere, because under management review, there's an input where you have to discuss further opportunities for integration. So going into your upgrade audit, you may only have a few things integrated, but we should see some things in management review discuss further integration of your requirements into your programs. Things like corrective action, internal audit, the document control and controller records. Those are really easy things to integrate. Down the road, there may be additional opportunities for integration. Management must provide adequate resources for implementation and improvement of the EMS. And that's the expectations of management now. These will be heavily audited during your upgrade audit and moving forward. So each department manager needs to understand what their aspects are and how they contribute to continue. Again, management needs to demonstrate commitment to the environmental policy. So our policy now is to protect the environment, including the prevention of pollution, to comply with our legal requirements and compliance obligations, and to continual improvement as needed to enhance environmental performance. This policy does need to be communicated again still to everyone working on our behalf, employees, temporary employees, contractors, and it must be made available to the public. And now they say it must be made available to interested parties. Okay, any questions so far? I'm telling you, it gets lonely here. If you guys don't start asking questions, I might need a little therapy. Okay. So again, not a lot has changed relative to the policy itself. This new general commitment to protect the environment is more general. So, you know, if I'm an auditor and I walk down in your site and I see the fence line chalked with litter, that's not. if I get to the lunch area and it's chock full of litter, or the smoking area full of smoking butts, that doesn't support our commitment to the protection of the environment. So it does take that commitment and make it a little bit more broad. And it can also include things that are maybe not significant aspects. The protection of the environment, can be related to a sustainability program. And maybe some of these sustainability measures aren't significant aspects, but they are, again, ways that the organization is working to protect the environment. 6.0, planning, big new word, risk and opportunities. Management must identify the risk and opportunities that need to be addressed. Okay, those are the buzzwords. We don't have to identify all risk and opportunities, any potential risk and opportunity. It says the organization shall identify the risk, not your registration company. I'm sure your auditor will have a bunch of ideas he thought you didn't miss, or that you missed, but the requirement is that the organization identifies risk and opportunities. Risk can come from three primary areas: our aspects, our compliance obligations, and any risk related to our scope of context. And then lastly, emergency conditions. So as a manager, you need to understand the risks that have been identified through those processes. It's management that needs to determine what the risks are. Usually it was this person called the environmental rep. They showed up to a meeting, they presented all their best ideas, management just nodded their head, and they went out of their way. We need to see evidence that management is involved in determining the risk and opportunities. That is very important. For each risk and opportunity we identify, we need to identify our planned actions to mitigate the risk or enhance the opportunity. So I think I've already said that. Again, risk will come from our significant aspects, our compliance obligations. Really, anything that we are obligated to comply with poses a potential risk. The risk that we're out of compliance. There may be specific compliance obligations that pose additional risk. We have an air permit that requires a thermal oxidizer. The oxidizer breaks down. The parts take 2 weeks to get here, or we're down for 2 weeks. That's a big risk. So what do? We identify the key components, and we order backup parts so that when or if they break down, we can repair them quite quickly. Other risks relative to our context. So I go to one location at their shipping bay, very common. They've got a storm drain, but their storm drains go to a river that is about 150 feet from the shipping bay. If something gets into that drain, there's literally no time to intercept that before it gets to the river. That's a risk. So what they've done is developed a unloading procedure. When they unload chemical oils, they cover the storm sewer up with a cover, and that shows that they've implemented a planned action to mitigate the risk that they've identified. So as you're seeing here, a lot of these things were things that we may have already been doing, but we need to start using some of the new words: risk and opportunities, intended outcomes of the environmental program, life cycle perspective. So a big part of the change is just being able to calibrate managers to be able to understand and respond to questions using some of these new terminologies. Environmental aspects, again, the definition really hasn't changed. An environmental aspect is an element of your activities, your product, or your services that can interact with the environment. So as an organization, you need to have a process to identify the aspects and determine which ones are the most significant. The new term is identify them from a life cycle perspective. And this is going to be from a life cycle of our product, or the life cycle of the service that we provide. And that's going to be related to our design, procurement, production, packaging and transportation, the use of our product, and then the ultimate disposal of our product. That is its life cycle. And we will talk more about that. Management needs to understand the aspects that they control. So if I'm a warehouse manager and I'm interviewed, I need to be able to say the biggest impact in my group is the fact that we recycle cardboard and we put the cardboard in the compactor, and that's one of our key measures is recycling. So each department, whether it's I'm a quality manager, I'm a shipping and logistics manager, I'm a purchasing manager, I need to understand the aspects that I can control or influence. So we'll throw that question out to everybody. Is there a specific aspect that you control or influence? And to get your certificate, you have to give me one aspect, or you don't get your certificate. I'm blackmailing people. What is the primary aspect that you manage in the course of your job? I got all day. I'm not going anywhere. Oh, Rita, pellets, plastic pellet loss. Yes, that's a good one. Lance does a lot of spill prevention. Checks the spill kits, keeps stuff contained. Jennifer looks at her wastewater discharge. That's nice. Okay, Alan, have you got one for me?
Electrical and water usage.
Okay, we got Alan chimed in verbally because maybe he's not chatting. Electrical and water. You saw electrical and water usage.
Water usage.
Excellent. Okay, I do appreciate that. Okay, now Alan hung up on me. Okay, so again, as a manager, it's incumbent that you understand your aspects identification process. So the way that we do this, first thing is we do as an organization, we identify all of our products that we make, the activities that we do, and any services that we provide. The next step is to identify are there aspects of those things that impact the environment, develop a criteria to evaluate their significance, determine our significant aspects, and lastly, identify potential risk and opportunities. So here's the picture that I love. Our activity here is oil storage. What is the aspect associated with oil storage? Is a potential leak or spill during the filling of the tank, and the impact is potential land and water pollution. So there's always a real clear linkage between activity, aspect, and then impact. So things that we control or influence, obviously activities within our facilities, suppliers and service providers, people that may deliver fuel to us, people that provide packaging, our waste haulers. Alan chiming back in. Okay. Contractors, on-site maintenance contractors. The guys that to service our forklifts, they come in and do electrical work for us. They install equipment. And then our outsourced services, we send parts off to be painted or heat treating, assembly outsourcing. Any process that we outsource, we do have an ability to influence their activities. So just looking at a standard process of injection molding, kind of a quick input-output analysis. We input some plastic resin, electricity, some new oil, some mold release to keep the thickened, some new gloves and some labor, and hopefully we output good parts. Some of our other outputs could be air emissions from the mold release, waste oil from the PMing of the machines. Occasionally we can make a scrap part. We have to get rid of some used gloves and dispose of some aerosol cans. So again, taking a look at the input-output process, we can develop a list of aspects. So the activity is injection molding. Some of the aspects would be oil usage and storage. One of the impacts would be the use of oil. We're depleting a natural resource. We store oil. We create a potential for spill and land pollution. We consume electricity. We deplete natural resources. So again, this is a little remedial for a lot of you, but when we identify aspects, it's first looking at an activity, aspects that impact the environment, and then the impacts. We have to consider things under their normal condition and under their emergency conditions. And based on this process, we develop a list of aspects. Now they're asking us to take a look at the identification of aspects and risk and opportunities from a life cycle perspective. So this will identify additional aspects for us. So there's two parts of the standard that talk about a life cycle perspective. 6.1 talks about the identification of risk and opportunities and aspects, and 8.1 talks about the controls associated with these life cycle aspects. So what is the life cycle of our product or service? It's really looking at the entire impact of our product across it, from the acquisition of the materials and design to the production of the product or service, distribution, the use of the product, and then the ultimate disposal or recycling of the product. So when you look at your standard electronic piece of equipment, your iPad, your laptop, there's a lot of trace metals that go into making that product. And when you extract the gold, the silver, the cadmium, the tin, the lead from the earth, there's significant impact in that mining operation. Production, there's a number of impacts. Distribution, it's a big deal. We've got to distribute that product to every Best Buy, and I think there's still Circuit Cities around, in the country. So there's a lot of impacts during distribution. The use of the product, not much, just really low voltage stuff. And then in the recovery or the recycling of those metals, there can be a lot of impact. Same with an automobile. Okay, we have to extract steel and oil from the earth. A lot of impact relative to the production of the vehicle, not a lot relative to distribution. The biggest impact is in the use of the vehicle. The consumer has to put gasoline in the vehicle. We consume gasoline. We burn the gasoline. We create air emissions. We have to service the vehicle. So we generate used oil and waste tires and other disposal. And then there's a possibility for recovery of the vehicle once it's used up. So here is what they've asked us to do. A good example is automobile, because a lot of you would be in automotive companies. Your product goes into an automobile. The weight of that product contributes to the weight of the vehicle, and the weight of the vehicle contributes to the fuel efficiency of the vehicle. So if you can design or build your product and make it lighter, you've then impacted the fuel efficiency of the vehicle, even though it might be pretty small depending on your part. And that's part of the life cycle that you've influenced. And that's really what to look at. I just did an audit for a headlight manufacturing company, and their design people had three key environmental design considerations. First of all was the aerodynamics of the headlight. Second was the power draw, because the power draw affects the size of the alternator, which affects the weight of the vehicle. And then the last consideration was the actual weight of the headlight assembly. So those are some of these life cycle considerations that they now want us to consider as we do our production. So again, the basic life cycle steps are design and engineering, both the design of our part and our processes. Acquisition of our materials, either the impact from the natural resources that we use, our procurement activities, and then the actual impact of our supply chain. The production processes, we've been kind of doing that for forever, but what that includes our production support processes, the management of our facility, and outsourced services that we may use. Transportation of our product and our waste. How the product is used, and then how our product is disposed of. Again, these are things that we need to be able to control or influence. We may not have any control or influence over how our product gets used. For the automotive people, the number one thing that we probably do is we provide information on what our product is made of through the IMDS process. A number of companies have aggressive product take-back programs. There's companies that'll take back, Hewlett-Packard will take back toner cartridges. Battery companies will return and take back batteries. Number of clients I have will take back their products and recycle them. But again, it just depends up to your organization. You also may not have a lot of control or influence over how your product gets disposed of. Lance says, what do you mean by the impact of our supply chain? Well, what I mean is when we make a decision to procure materials from a supplier, we influence what supplier we choose. And what are the criteria that we might use? I mean, do we expect them to have a quality certification? Do we expect them to have an environmental system? Do we tell them that they need to abide by all local environmental in regulations? Do we go out and inspect their operations? Do we give them a specification that says, when your supplies show up to our door, you must meet these specifications? Those would be ways that you would influence your supply chain. If you go to the ISO cert in the appendix, it clearly identifies and says there may be suppliers that we cannot control or influence. Maybe our customer tells us, you will use Joe's heat treating. At that point, we've kind of given up a lot of our ability to control or influence the supply chain. Okay, so if I'm a design or engineering manager, the first step is what are my aspects? Well, we start off with what are our activities. So if we do product design, or if we're a service company, if we design our service process, how we deliver the service, that's considered part of design. Well, when we design our product, we select the material. We might be able to influence product durability, product packaging design. When we quote a new program, they may ask us to use new chemicals. So under material selection, one aspect of the materials we select would be its recyclability, and then our impact is hopefully the ability to avoid the landfill. The product durability, well, it affects the life of our product, and if I'm putting a part into an automobile, and I can design my part to last, 300,000 miles instead of 150,000, that influences how often the vehicle might break down or need to be serviced. When I quote a new program and the customer wants me to use trimethyl DEF to process their part, we may just decide we can't do that business. When I design a process, I select equipment. I specify equipment. Well, the aspect of my equipment specification would be the energy efficiency of the equipment. Now, just keep in mind here, what we're doing now is identifying aspects. These may or may not turn out to be significant relative to what we do. But the requirement is that as a manager, you need to understand the aspects associated with what you in your department does. These may not turn out to be significant relative to the oxidizer we have, the wastewater system we have, but they could be significant down the road, and they now must be identified from the life cycle perspective. So what I'm trying to convey here is, first, these are the aspects that you as a manager need to understand, and secondly, these are the aspects that may need to be added to your aspects matrix. If I'm a purchasing or supply chain manager, one of the biggest things that I do is I select suppliers. I need to buy plastic resin. I've 4 suppliers that can provide it to me. I make the determination who I use. So, again, what are the aspects related to that decision? Well, first, it's the footprint of the provider. I can't tell them how to do their business, but when I look at 4 providers, if I can pick the most responsible environmental organization, that has a big impact on the environment. How far the supplier is from us impacts the transportation impacts. Excuse me. Keep trying to drink more, but it's not helping. So the distance the supplier is from us impacts the environment. Material selection. If I buy things, do I specify a recycled content? That impacts the use of natural resources. A packaging specification. Do I tell them how I want things packaged? Or do I specify give us a quote based on returnable dunnage? So again, as a purchasing manager, these are the ways that I impact the environment. And as you can see, it's a real simple linkage between what I do as a purchasing manager, what the aspects are associated with those activities, and then what the impacts are. And as a purchasing manager, I should be able to look at my long aspects list and determine which aspects I can impact as a purchasing manager. And when you look at the total impact of any one given product, if you look at the impact of your complete supply chain, I've heard it said that their impacts are 4 to 10 times greater than what your own impacts are. So any influence that we can make over our supply chain will go a long ways toward minimizing the total environmental footprint of our product. And this is the thought process that the ISO people are trying to get organizations to start making. Operations and quality, again, these are going to be your standard aspects associated with production and quality. You probably have most of these already identified. But as a quality manager, one of the things we do is we have an incoming inspection of our components and supplies. Well, that's an activity. Well, one of the impacts of that activity is that we can reject materials that don't meet our specification. And when we do that, we typically get the supplier to transport that back to their shop. So that impacts the environment. So when we reject materials or we reject components, that aspect is an aspect of our incoming inspection process. And there's multiple impacts associated with transporting that material back to the supplier. Again, if I'm a maintenance manager, I need to understand that when I change my light bulb, one of the aspects is the recycling of the bulbs or the universal waste. And when I use an aerosol can, I have to dispose of it properly. Oil usage and leaks, response process. So again, as a maintenance manager, you should be able to go to your aspects list and say, here's the aspects that I can influence. These contribute to our performance measurables this way, and here's how I direct my people to do their job. Environmental impact of scrap parts. I just put the slide in because the simple act of generating a scrap or a bad part is not just a recycling aspect. When you scrap a part, you've wasted all the environmental impacts associated with driving that material to the site. You've wasted the utilities it took to make the part, the labor it took to make the part, the fact that we now must either regrind or send the part off to a recycler, and then the recycler uses a lot of energy to recycle the material. So yeah, it's better than landfill, but there is a pretty big impact associated with making a scrap part. And I think a lot of organizations might undervalue the significance of scrap. One of the nice things about calling scrap significant is that your production employees, that is the number one thing that they do to impact the environment, is making good parts. And it's very easy to explain to the production guys how they can do their part by making first-time quality an issue, a priority with them. Again, the environmental impact of recycling, it's very labor intensive. You've got the transportation impact associated with it and the energy and resources needed to recycle the material. So yes, recycling is better than the landfilling the material, but the impacts are not free. And again, just consider that the hierarchy is reduce, reuse, recycle, where recycling is the last line of defense against the landfill. And a lot of environmental programs, I think, have lost sight of areas where they're actually reusing materials, where they're actually reducing, material efficiency. The quality programs probably already measure and monitoring that, how efficient we are with our material. That tends to be much more significant than some of these other activities. So if we can be more efficient with the steel, be more efficient with the resins we use, plastics, be more efficient with energy we use, that's often a bigger deal than the actual waste itself. A logistics manager, again, looking at the transportation impacts of transporting things to our customer. This includes the diesel usage of the transportation vehicles, the combustion of the diesel, the fact that we periodically have to expedite freight, the loading capacity of trailers. Can we increase the load density, get more stuff on one shipment? Can our procurement people consolidate vendors to reduce the number of shipments that we receive? Transportation of our waste, either the number of pickups or the size of the containers. So my question is, what's more significant? The drum of used oil in maintenance that might spill, or the fact that we expedite freight twice a week? You know, very few people consider expedited freight a significant environmental impact, but they all look at that drum of used oil and go, that's significant. Because one day we could pick it up, we could haul it over to our shipping bay. Right as we are loading it onto our truck, it could spill and get down into the storm sewer. And that's a big deal. Has it ever happened? No. But it could happen, and it's, you know, so again, just take a look at your criteria for determining significance. In some of these things like expedited freight, scrap cost, those types of things might start to look a little bit more significant to you. Again, when you have to expedite freight to a customer because you missed a production schedule or for some other reason that you can control or influence, there's a lot more impact relative to transportation, the consumption of diesel, and the air emissions it creates. Okay, so now we've identified our aspects. We've considered a life cycle perspective. Each of you as managers understands the aspects in your departments. The next step is to take a look at risk and opportunities. So, as we talked about earlier, risk and opportunities can come from three, probably four primary areas. First is from our significant aspects. Second would be from a compliance obligation. Third would be from something relative to our context or scope. And fourth would be something relative to a potential emergency condition. So when you take a look at your significant aspects, again, there's very clear linkage between the activity, the aspect, the impact, the risk and opportunity, and then lastly, our planned actions. So the first example here is we operate a compressed air system. One aspect of our compressed air system is the consumption of electricity. Another aspect is the fact that we dispose of oily condensate water. So let's focus on electricity. Obviously, we use electricity. It consumes a natural resource, not rest virus. I thought I fixed that. I guess I didn't. What are the risks? Well, one risk is that we develop air leaks. Another risk is the compressors can get left on over the weekend or can get left on when they're not needed. So these guys, to mitigate the risk of air leak, they train people to report air leaks and maintenance guys to open up work orders and fix them. And then secondly, they implemented a quarterly air leak survey. Compressors being left on over the weekend, they created a plant shutdown checklist, and they trained employees that were responsible for shutting the plant down to make sure that the compressor gets turned off. So if you think of risk, you can think of ways the aspect can fail, or failure modes. And I actually went to one site that's what they identified were failure modes of their aspects. Injection molding, one aspect is we use oil. Potential impact of that is just the consumption of oil. The risk is that our equipment leaks. And then the planned action are the monthly preventative maintenance activities. Another aspect is the potential for there to be a spill. That's a risk. So they implement a spill plan and training, and they do equipment inspections, including their spill kits. Jennifer says, how do you document your life cycle perspective and life cycle analysis? How I've done that is to take a look at your aspects list and then split it up under each section of the life cycle. So design and engineering, I put that header, then I list the design and engineering aspects. Procurement, material acquisition, then I list the aspects associated with procurement. We continue to keep the same aspects relative to production. I then put another section about aspects related to transportation, aspects related to the use of our product, and then aspects related to the disposal of our product. Under the use of our product or service, if we don't control or influence the use of it, I just put no aspects. If we don't control the disposal of our product, again, there I just put no aspects. But I leave those sections on the list so the auditor can see that we considered them. So that's one way to do it. So again, these are the risks and opportunities relative to our significant aspects. These must be documented in our environmental program. You can document these on your aspects list. You can document them in another form. There really are a number of different ways to identify the risk and opportunities. Risk and opportunities relative to our compliance obligations. Again, as I think we've said before, every compliance obligation represents some risk to us. The risk that we can be out of compliance. I don't think we need to identify every risk, but there may be some specific risks that do apply to us. So here's a good example. As the site has an SPCC plan, the risk is that the inspections required don't get performed. Another risk is that operational changes get made, which influences our oil storage containment or areas, and the SPCC plan doesn't get updated. So those are two risks. So the planned action was to add the SPCC inspections to their PM work order system so that even when Joe is gone, that work order gets issued and somebody else would hopefully do the inspection that month. Implemented a management of change procedure, and they added the SPCC review to that. So anytime a change gets made, somebody considers, do we need to update the plan? This organization identified an opportunity. We may be able to get below 1,200 gallons and eliminate the need for the plant altogether. So yes, I know the real number is 1,320, but I wouldn't want to get to 1,300 and then eliminate the plan, because the first time I get an excess drum, then I'm out of compliance. But for some organizations, if you could just control how much oil gets ordered at any one time, you could get below the threshold quantity for even needing a plan. Under the hazard communications rules, there's a risk that our secondary containers are not labeled. That's never happened, right? Or there's an opportunity that we could standardize and improve our labeling process. So their planned action was to continue to implement their hazard communications plan and employee training and investigate new labeling systems. So again, a lot of this is stuff that we've already considered in our programs, but there's an additional requirement to specifically identify the risk and document that risk. And it's important that managers in the various departments understand the risk and opportunities in their area. This is a level of awareness that many times we don't see in organizations. Other issues relative to our scope and our context. Again, we talked about the storm drain example earlier. Here's a risk that the company has a limited access to the financial capital. Risk, they're unable to authorize continuous improvement projects. Another issue might be language issues. We have employees that speak different languages. The risk is they don't understand the program or work instructions because of the language issues. Maybe we have to put some signage up or some work instructions we do in two languages. But those would be risk relative to our context. And then all of these things need to get boiled down and formulated into an aspects matrix. You guys already have one. You might need to update it. I'm going to pull up an example. If I have one here. If I can share my... If I can share my desktop, I'll bring up a... No, that's not what I want to do. I'll bring up a example aspects matrix. Okay, so it says I'm now sharing. So at this point, you guys should be able to see my top. And I'll just pull up an example aspects matrix so you can kind of see. This one's not complete, but you'll see how we've changed our aspects list to reflect the new requirements. So in this particular list, we list the activity, then the aspect. We put the headers in for engineering and design, procurement, and production and facilities management, product packaging, and product usage, and end of life. So under each of those headers is where we'll put the various activities and the related aspects. So this is how we've shown our life cycle perspective. When you take a look at this approach, we've identified the impacts. We've split up to try to show a little bit of a risk assessment, the environmental risk based on severity, frequency, environmental risk. We've identified business risk in concerns of interested stake parties, a management concern, or impact the reputation, ability to improve, compliance obligations, and then a business risk, come up with a total score, and that was what we used to determine significance. We also included a couple more columns here about places to put compliance obligations, specific risk or opportunities, and then a linkage to specific operational controls, and notes to remind us what we did and why we did it. So there's nothing magical about this approach, but it seems to work. Okay, so we now ended the sharing. And we'll go back to the presentation. So however you want, your organization has chosen to show that life cycle perspective is probably okay. But again, for each manager, you need to understand where your aspects are on that matrix and be able to say, logistics is here. I can see these are my aspects, and here's what I influence. That's now the new expectation for management. Okay. Okay. So that's it for aspects and impacts, risk and opportunities, and life cycle perspective. We still have an obligation to understand our compliance obligations. That came out of our newfound knowledge of our interested parties and what they expect from us. So we can have our compliance obligations can include the regulations, customer requirements, and corporate requirements. So again, as a maintenance manager, I should understand that my light bulb recycling is a universal waste, and it is a compliance obligation, and that's why it's important that the containers are closed, that they're labeled and dated. So as a manager, I need to understand what compliance obligations I can impact in my department. You don't have to be able to cite CFRs. You don't have to be able to explain regulatory strategies. You just need to understand the basics of the compliance obligations. Environmental objectives, again, management needs to understand how environmental objectives get set and should be involved in setting the objectives. This should no longer be one person's best ideas. These objectives should be set by the management team. Organization starting to set objectives for each department. If a purchasing objective, get our suppliers from 200 vendors down to 150 vendors. That's an environmental objective. Production, scrap rate, shipping, expedited freight. It's easy to set objectives in each of these functional areas and call them environmental objectives and take credit for what these guys are already doing probably. Each objective needs to have a champion. It should be documented properly and needs to be reviewed periodically by management. So again, here's just some examples of different types of objectives. One of the things we want to try to do is link our objectives to our performance measures. And then you also want to try to link your objectives to some measurable improvement. And again, these are just examples of things we've used in the past. Environmental support, again, management must provide adequate resources. This is people in their time, equipment, technology. When one environmental person leaves, if you don't have somebody hired, you need to fill that gap with somebody in the interim. You guys need to ensure that the people in your department are competent based on their education, training, and experience. You need to make everybody aware of the environmental policy and the significant aspects associated with your department. You must communicate about the environmental program to your people. Don't count on the general town hall meeting once a year, once a quarter, to do that for you. As a manager, you need to communicate these requirements to your people. And we want to see that communication process much more proactive and be inclusive of your performance measures. Again, operational controls, this is how we need to control the aspects in our department. So if I'm a quality manager, how am I controlling my scrap rate? If I'm a maintenance manager, how am I controlling my universal waste, my oil disposal, the operation of a parts washer? If I'm manager of the paint line, how am I controlling my air emissions off of the paint line and the disposal of my hazardous waste? So again, it's a big deal to understand the operational controls that you're responsible. We need to review changes. There needs to be a management of change process. So when changes occur in your department, how are they reviewed to determine, does it impact our environmental program? If I bring in a new aerosol, a new parts washer, a new solvent, how does that get reviewed to determine changes in the environmental program? Management of change is going to be a big deal in your upcoming audits. And then also control and influence from a life cycle perspective. How do we control and influence our outsourced services and suppliers, design and engineering, and our contractors and service providers? So just as some examples of different types of operational controls, overfill alarms on tanks, containment systems for our oils, a dust collector for our particulate air emissions, setting up recycling stations and labeling of recycling containers are all types of operational controls. A paint booth where we have paint filters and we have a paint hood system that takes away the vapors, a thermal oxidizer that can destruct the vapors, a filter press we might use to process wastewater, or our utility meters where we use to measure our consumption of water, our consumption of natural gas, or our consumption of electrical usage. These are different ways that you as managers control the aspects in your area. The other way that we control them are through our training programs, through the development of work instructions and other procedures to make sure jobs are being done within their associated criteria. Okay. Emergency response. Again, as a manager, you need to understand the defined emergency response procedures for the organization. These will cover tornadoes, spills, fires, power outages, and it's got to be very clear what your role and responsibility is during any of those events. We need to maintain equipment, spill kits, fire suppression systems, fire extinguishers, those types of things. We need to periodically conduct drills and then review after a drill or a spill how the event went. So it's really important to see that there's some kind of a review process after a drill or a spill. So things like spill kits, sewer cover mats, fire suppression systems are all critical parts of your emergency response process. Okay, performance. Now, again, this section got expanded pretty significantly because I think all managers, not just environmental managers, but all managers need to have some input into deciding what the environmental measurables are for the organization. So a couple of key definitions are environmental performance. The standard says it's performance related to the management of our environmental aspects. This includes results from internal audits, evaluations of compliance, actions for management review, meeting objectives, and our environmental indicators or measurables. So we need to have established performance criteria. And anytime we choose to measure something for performance, we need to set a target for what we expect it to achieve. Now, the environmental performance measurable does not have to target an improvement. It just has to have a criteria. So an example might be for electrical usage, our performance criteria might be plus or minus 5% of what we used last year. Or it could be targeting a reduction. Effectiveness. We need to be able to have measures of the effectiveness of our environmental system. And there's a lot more emphasis on measuring effectiveness. And then the indicator is going to be some measurable representation of either performance or effectiveness of the management or the environmental aspect. So here's a nice pretty diagram out of a standard called ISO 14031. It's a guidance document specifically on how to measure environmental performance. And if you get bored, you can read that, but it actually is quite a nice guidance document on the concept of establishing performance. It talks about three key types of indicators. Operational performance indicators. These would be types of indicators mostly relative to our production and our actual aspects. A management performance indicator. A lot of these deal with management system activities and effectiveness of our system. And then the term key performance indicator is something to indicate these are indicators that we consider to be key to our organization. They could include either an organizational indicator or a management indicator. So some examples of management performance indicators would be indicators relative to our management policies. Percentage of employees trained, percentage of work orders on time, percentage of corrective actions on time. Related to regulatory compliance, numbers of findings that maybe our corporation comes in annually, the number of findings or the percent of findings closed. And that might be something that you report out on during a monthly managers meeting. We had 15 findings, they're 50% closed. Next month, 75% closed. Next third month, 100% closed. Financial performance indicators, management loves those. And then other indicators that might be relative to the community. Operational indicators, how efficient do we manage our materials? Energy management, supply and delivery, number of miles product transported, aspects related to our products, our waste, our emissions. These would be things like the consumption of energy, air emissions from a thermal oxidizer, how much scrap do we generate? And then defining environmental performance. I like this definition. It says environmental performance evaluation is a management process that uses key indicators to compare our past with our present to determine, are we meeting our objectives? And again, I want managers to become more proactive in the process of defining the performance measurables and looking at, are these really indicative of our performance? So the goals are really helpful to identify trends in our performance, to help us to establish objectives, to review and improve efficiency. I don't think our goal is to use less stuff. Our goal is to produce more stuff for what we use. And then to be able to report our environmental performance internally and externally and have the numbers make sense. You know, I get into sites and they say one of our performance measurables is cardboard recycling, and they showed me, you know, monthly cardboard recycling data. It makes no sense. All they're showing me is how much cardboard they recycled. It wasn't how much they avoided getting into the landfill. And is their goal really to, you know, their goal is not to show me how much they, their goal is to get every piece of cardboard recycled instead of the landfill. And this measuring how much they use per month doesn't tell me anything. And the big joke is, if you're not making your cardboard goal, are you going to go out to your neighbors and get more cardboard so you can achieve your cardboard goal? We've got to get these performance indicators. Performance evaluation. Again, an effective EMS can lead to improved environmental performance. Your auditors are really going to be focused on how you measure performance, and are your activities really resulting in improved performance. So managers need to understand the performance criteria and how their department supports that. So it's really important to try to set meaningful performance criteria. Trending data year after year so you can see the trends, that's important. Trying to normalize data versus direct measurements is really important. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes not so much. But if you can try to normalize things for production rates and growth, that can be helpful. And you can have any number of metrics that are related to quality, operations, financial, or HR. So a scrap rate might be a quality measurable, but it's also an environmental measurable. A material efficiency measurable. How much material do we buy versus how much goes out in our product? That may be an operations measurable, but that's also an environmental measurable. So don't be shy about double dipping with stuff that other departments are already doing. So here's just some examples of operational performance indicators versus management system performance indicators. You know, raw material used per unit of product, energy used per unit of product, how much you can conserve, the number of emergency events or spills. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but I just want to give you some good examples. And over time, we're hoping that these performance measurables will increase in their ability to measure our efficiency. Again, just some more examples of monitoring and measurement. Rena, glad you're here. Got to go. I understand. We are just about done. And last but not least, the continual improvement process. We need to be able to demonstrate that we have a process to identify opportunities. We have a process to establish planned actions. We monitor improvement. We monitor effectiveness. And the output should be satisfied stakeholders. And within the environmental program, regulators, employees, neighbors, owners, customers, these are the stakeholders in our environmental program. Again, kind of wrapping down here a little bit, one of the big deals with standard is an understanding of these new concepts and issues. The context of the organization, what does that mean? What are the internal and external issues that can impact your environmental system? Who are the interested parties? What are their compliance obligations? What are the intended outcomes in the scope of our EMS? What are the risks and opportunities that I as a manager can influence? How is my EMS aligned with the strategic direction? What are the environmental performance measures? How do I influence them? How do I integrate these things into our business? What do I control or influence? What are the environmental requirements for design and procurement? These are going to be the things that the more confidence that you can exude during your registration audit and respond to these, the smoother your audit will go. So here's your homework. For those of you that are not environmental managers, go find your environmental procedures on your network. Where are they? Get somebody to review the process for the identification of aspects and risk and opportunities. Take a look at your aspects and determine, can you find your department's aspects on the aspects list? If you can't, have somebody explain that to you. Review your current environmental objectives and your environmental measurables. Can you find ways that your department can influence those and help? Are there any department level objectives that you could set? If you're a procurement manager, if you're a logistics manager, if you're a maintenance manager, are there environmental objectives that you could set for your department? Look at how often you discuss environmental issues with your team and periodically talk about these things during your normal communications process, and explain to people how they help to protect the environment and how they can contribute to environmental performance. So that's it. If you have any questions, please let us know. If any questions come up afterwards and just in the night when you sleep and you have memories of this training event, go ahead and send me an email. We'd love to share ideas and issues with people. If you need help getting ready for an upcoming audit, please think of us. We do internal audits, compliance evaluations. We've helped people upgrade their documentation. They've been very successful in implementing the life cycle perspective. So if you have any additional needs for support, please do let us know. And I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, we'll hang out here for a few minutes. And if not, thank you for your time.